The aim of the Cochrane expedition was to dive along the coast of Asia Minor, locate ancient wrecks, and catalog their locations. We knew the Aegean Sea and the Turkish coast were a graveyard of maritime traffic for over 4,000 years. Our journey started in Athens. The American School of Classical Studies was located on the site of the ancient Agora. Here, during the classic age of Greece, this was the social gathering place for people of Athens. Here they came to share the news of the day, recreate themselves, and listen to orators who would proclaim their views and politics. 51 years ago, Dr. Virginia Grace, an archaeologist with Princeton University, was directing a major dig in the Agora. At that time, she was the leading world authority on amphoras, those earthenware vessels that were the jerry cans and containers of the ancient world. Raised from land digs, they are fragmented and have to be pieced together. We would soon enough be finding them unbroken by the thousands. For a real tosspot who might fall down later, this was a fine way to drink. In the pub or home, the wine was usually mixed with water. It had a resinous taste because the amphoras were coated inside with resin. Today, the Greek Retsina wine is still mixed with resin. Our expedition ship was the Little Vigilant, a handsome 71-foot motor sailor built for Drayton Cochrane in Germany. He pulled her out the previous year at a little rural boatyard on the island of Spetsi. We gathered there to get her ready for sea. I carried the flag of the Explorers Club. A week's hard work and she was ready. An ice cream vendor stood by on the big day as Little Vigilant slid down the ways. As an afterthought, the workers grabbed the bow line and barely kept her from getting away. Before we departed Spetsi, I rowed across the harbor to look in upon a potter, a maker of amphoras. This encounter with a craft and its tools unchanged in thousands of years was the first among many such experiences we had when we visited ashore at little villages in the Cyclades and Dodecanese Islands. His small amphoras were being made for storage of olive oil and wine. The shaping of clay on a potter's wheel is as sensually beautiful as anything I have seen. With clear, warm weather and kind winds that make cruising the Aegean such a joy in early summer, Little Vigilant departed Spetsi. 100 weeping maidens waved us goodbye. Drayton Cochrane, owner and skipper, was a seasoned mariner. He commanded a destroyer escort during World War II. Johnny Cochrane, his son, was an able first mate. On summer vacation from the University of Miami, he had crewed for me on my own boat. John Ryder, on leave from Harvard, was a mainstay of our dive team and a friend of the family. And that's my leg. That summer of '61, we were young, fearless, untried divers on the greatest adventure of our lives. On the ferry to Spetsi, my attention had been called to a large buoy that I was told marked the grave of a Greek destroyer. We located it and suited up with the fearlessness of youth to dive on the Idra, a 1,280-ton warship sunk by Stuka dive bombers the day Germany invaded Greece 20 years before. She lay untouched on the bottom, 235 feet below. Excitement in the first descent mixed with apprehension. The wreck did not emerge from the fog of distance until we were past 100 feet down. It was a time capsule, undisturbed, helm, binnacle, engine telegraphs, all as fleeing survivors had left the bridge. An account of the sinking by survivors had been read to me when I visited the Naval Ministry in Piraeus. The bridge wing had been strafed and the captain mortally wounded. As he fell into the arms of his second officer, he cried out, "See now, men of Greece, how a Greek captain dies." Classic heroics by a man descended from a classic age. This was a dream wreck. We soared like birds over it, half narked by the depth. A machine gun not yet frozen in time could still be moved and aimed. At the base of an anti-aircraft gun was a litter of spent shells. Among these, in the carpet of mollusks, Ryder found a human bone, a tibia, evidence that the gunner had been cut down at his post. Strangely, no other human remains were found. We had no explanation for that. Most of us experienced elements of narcosis. Susie Phipps seemed immune from that hazard until, on the third dive, she began to lose control at 180 feet. I unknowingly recorded the near tragedy. John held in her mouthpiece and, taking her by the arm, ascended to safety with her. We made 9 dives in 5 days, adhering to the Navy diving tables, all short dives, of course, because of the depth, and miraculously survived. Susie was so happy to be saved by John that she married him within a year after the trip. Those early neoprene wetsuits were also used in insane asylums for restraint of the dangerous. I abandoned my camera long enough to liberate the port riding light of the Hydra. It would not be missed when the brave ship was blown apart for salvage, and John got the bone for Halloweens to come. Under bare poles and light airs, we cruised eastward through the Cyclades Islands. We went ashore at small fishing villages, almost totally isolated by time and distance. Traffic was not heavy on the main street. No tourists stopped here. We might have arrived from outer space. Some children ran to stare at us. Others hid and watched us from behind a communal bake oven. A woman in the basic black universal dress spun raw wool from a stick onto a spindle, as she had learned to do from her mother, and probably 2,000 years of mothers before that. The only moving parts of the ancient art were the dexterous fingers of the hands. The lady must have wondered why we stopped to watch such a common household activity. John Ryder, later to become a school teacher in the Hawaiian Islands, had a way with children. Moored by the private island of Stavros Niarchos, the Greek shipping magnate, was the 3-masted schooner Creole. One of the most beautiful sailing yachts in the world, she was built by Camper and Nicholson for Drayton Cochrane's grandfather. As a young boy, he had sailed in her. The Aegean sun can be hot in summer. We rigged the bosun's chair and took turns cooling off at 12 knots. On eastward with clear skies and kind winds to the much-visited, popular, but still picturesque island of Mykonos. Before we could enter the harbor, we were intercepted by customs officers. a well-entrenched bureaucracy in the eastern Mediterranean. They wanted to see our papers. Drady knew they couldn't read English. Anything official-looking with enough seals would do, so we were ready for them. They loved our efficiency, smiled and nodded as they studied the imposing document, and cheerfully passed us through. We walked the tidy, narrow streets with houses so close on either side that work and local traffic was shaded from the summer sun. The old windmill, still functioning, is a Mykonos landmark, probably visited by several thousand tourists each summer. At day's end, like a land mariner, the keeper furls his sails. With almost 3,000 years of maritime traffic before our arrival, we thought the bottom of the harbor must be loaded with goodies. So we built our own tow sled, took turns riding it, covered acres of bottom, found nothing, and had a great time. Underway again, weather holding, good reading time. Ever eastward through the islands to the Turkish coast, our destination, Bodrum, the small, quiet headquarters for the Turkish sponge diving fleet. The town crowds close around the rim of a natural harbor, backed by hills we easily climbed for an overview. 2,000 years ago, this was a seaport of wealth and consequence. Its name was Halicarnassus, and it boasted one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the tomb of King Mausolus. It was a link in the maritime trade that extended from Egypt to the Black Sea. Over the millennia, a rising sea had covered the mole that once protected the inner harbor. Old and new dress in this Muslim country is the legacy of Kemal Ataturk's revolution that dragged Turkey into the modern world. This time, little Vigilant's course was westward to the reef of Yasa Ada, a treacherous island that commanded the approaches to Bodrum. Rasim and Mustafa, 2 local divers who had been with Throckmorton, joined us, good men both. And Haki Bey, a Turkish museum director attached to us for security. The winds were picking up. An account of diving at Yasa Ada by an American, Peter Throckmorton, had told of centuries of ancient wreckage on the sea bottom there. That had been the genesis of this expedition. We anchored in 5 fathoms, excitement growing. The game was afoot. With expectations for raising objects from the bottom as well as an increase to our diving team of 5, we had hired one of the Bodrum sponge boats for our diving. We descended to 20 feet at the top of a sloping ridge. As focus on the bottom resolved, it was immediately evident that Throckmorton's account had not been exaggerated. The bottom was covered with the shards of amphoras, literally carpeted with the parts. The depth still so shallow that storms had scattered and smashed the fragile cargoes. We would go deeper to find what we hoped would be unbroken amphoras. The algae were heavier here. As we brushed it aside, we found the underburden of shards. Then by going under the shards, we hit our first jackpot, a beautiful, fully intact amphora. John Ryder found it heavy. By venting air into it, he could heft it over the bottom to set it aside with others our team was uncovering. Susie discovered the airlift technique and also discovered that what her air was displacing was 1,000 years of sediment. Her head vanished in it. We thought we'd lost her. Before running out of air, the amphora ascended, taking her with it. The skipper was as excited as the divers. This was really his expedition. The amphoras were the first tangible results from a year of planning. We flushed them out with the saltwater hose, often evicting frightened and outraged dwellers. In their age-old rest on the bottom, these once smooth carriers of oil and wine had undergone a sea change into something rich and strange. Lest the hot Aegean sun dry out and crack them, we kept our treasures wet under a dampened blanket. Between dives, our tough, portable Bauer compressor charged our tanks, a safe 2300 psi back then. And our Turkish escorts, as well as divers, knew the efficacy of a midday siesta. So far, we had explored shallow water little more than 2 boats' lengths from the island. It was a good guess that other ships might have drifted into deeper water before they sank. At 75 feet, sloping gradually downward, no shards appeared, and the algae was, if anything, thicker. Then, when John's fins had swept the algae aside, the opening revealed a cluster of unbroken amphoras. The globular shapes had been before us all the time, thinly hidden by the algae. This wreck's entire cargo was deep enough to have slept undisturbed by the storm waves far above. We'd found a mother lode of perfect amphoras. They were heavy with sediment, the wax seals gone. Airlifting was again the obvious way. We worked with alternate shifts, sending a dozen or more to the surface where waiting divers received them. The previous year, when Peter Throckmorton had dived here with Racim and Mustafa, they had no means for retrieving the amphoras. Now his dream of returning to his find was realized as he handed up one of the big amphoras and a clutch of small ones. He had traveled a long way round trip for this. This was one happy man. As Peter helps Mustafa to freedom, one must wonder that scuba diving ever advanced beyond its infancy. These suits inevitably led to frustration and muscular convulsions. The first amphoras from the rubble in shallow water proved to be from the island of Rhodes, 1st century AD. The 2 wrecks that we found in deeper water with the globular amphoras were Roman from the Byzantine period, 4th century AD. In our short week of diving at Yassa Ada, we had explored only a fraction of the reef area. We met sponge divers at work near Yassa Ada, plying a trade with equipment unchanged in centuries. Hard hats, hoses, and hand-cranked compressors were still the basics. These divers are the eyes of the underwater world. Archaeologists depend on them for leads to be explored. Throckmorton had met such divers in a Bodrum tavern and had in turn been directed to Yassa Ada. Men like this diver come up, aged before their time. Inevitably crippled with the bends, they continue diving until they are broken. The raw sponge is, of course, a living animal. It is pounded and rinsed and evicted from its skeleton. Then it is trimmed to provide the bath sponge that I knew as a boy, and that in this day is virtually obsolete. Our treasure of amphoras were housed in the old Bodrum fortress. They would be the seminal collection for a proposed museum for archaeological material from under the sea. The Mayan civilization, a world away, had reached its height when this Byzantine amphora went to the bottom. This Rhodian amphora, by special permission, was given to Virginia Grace for her collection. Now it was time to move on. The course of Little Vigilant was now south from Bodrum, then east around the northern end of the island of Rhodes, where we stopped for water and supplies and pushed on. We manned the halyards, set all sails, and with a bone in her teeth, our ship bucked the increasing winds of late summer. The weather clock was ticking. Touching too short a stop at the ancient, now deserted city of Myra, we reached our final dive site, Gelidonia Burnu. A mile off the headland, a bleak, barren rock marked a deep passage through which the tides ripped. A year before, a Bodrum sponge diver had found a small bronze box. Throckmorton picked up the clue. That was all we had for this far reach to the east. You may notice that my hairline was going fast. There wasn't much left. The anchor had hardly grabbed before we were over the side, visions of bronze dancing in our eyes. There was no quick bronze fix. We found ourselves in a maze of ravines, rock pinnacles, murky water, algae-blanketed bottom, and 70 feet deep, dropping off fast and deeper on either side of a ridge. We searched in teams, 3 dives a day for 2 days, found many anchors, bucked a murderous current between tides, and discovered no wreckage. The skipper gave us one more day, a fateful day as it turned out. John and Susie surfaced to announce that they had found something. We followed them down for a look. Susie, who had found it, pointed it to us. We saw nothing, and then we did see it. The object with 4 extended corners had been right there before us, probably passed over dozens of times. Whatever it was had merged with the bottom, and we discovered had to be pried up with hammer and crowbar, having been cemented to the bottom by the accretion of coralline algae over hundreds of years. The object could not be swum to the surface. It turned out to weigh about 50 pounds, and we had no lift bags. With eyes now attuned to the shape, we began to find others. The tools we worked with to break them loose hardly qualified for professional archaeology. And work we did. Skipper allowed us just 2 more days to raise what we could find. Open patches in the hard pan bottom enabled us to fan away the sand and search with our fingers in the soft deposits and under the ledges. There we found real pay dirt, bronze objects I will show you in a moment. The objects attached to lines were brought up hand over hand, 8 of them, weighed and measured. We later learned that they were ancient ingots of copper called cowhides, mined in Cyprus, a major source of copper in the ancient world. Copper ingots, splashes of melted bronze, a stone mortar, and a fine collection of bronze weapons and tools composed our treasure. A bronze dagger with blade and tang, and a double-bitted axe head were the 2 artifacts that dated our wreck from the late Bronze Age, 1300 BC. Researching in the Princeton University Library, I found copies of Egyptian tomb drawings dated about 1520 BC, showing a people identified as the Kefti, carrying cowhides of copper as tribute to the pharaoh. Artifacts raised during the next 2 summers identified our wreck as a merchant trade ship from Cyprus that had a forge, raw copper and zinc, and would make new bronze wares for trading along the coast. It perished at its first landfall. After dropping off our Turkish friends and our treasure in Bodrum, little Vigilant, her course west by northwest, and close-hauled beat her way back to Piraeus in the teeth of the Meltane. We entered Greek sea space, the Greek flag and the Explorers Club flag aloft and together again. Our landfall, as it had been our departure point from the Greek mainland almost 2 months earlier, was a temple to Poseidon at Cape Sunium. One of the finest experiences and adventures of my life had fulfilled its time. This had been an exploratory expedition, but the discovery of the Bronze Age wreck generated a full-scale archaeological dig directed by a young graduate student, George Bass. He went on to raise our Byzantine wreck and become a great name in underwater archaeology. This was just the beginning. Bob Ballard would bring electronic eyes into the sea and sweep the ancient trade routes for wrecks and cargoes. Everything in its time, and that summer long ago had been our brief but wonderful time as explorers.